Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this presentation was written and recorded. These are the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the Gunnaburong people. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the long history of knowledge sharing, storytelling, and connection to country. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Hello and welcome to How Did You Get That? Comedy as an Industry, Mateship, and Australian Comedy Podcasts. Using the Little Dum Dum Club as a case study, I aim to show how comedy chatcasts reveal some of the cultural norms and conventions of Australian stand-up as an industry by performing the backstage. Running since 2010, the Little Dum Dum Club is an Australian comedy chatcast hosted by two professional comedians, Tommy Daslow and Carl Chandler. It features guests who are usually also professional comedians, or at least entertainers or public figures. Loosely, the podcast is two mates chatting to some of their other mates about the things going on in their lives. In an episode, a guest or a host will attempt to tell a story while the others interrupt with jokes, questions, or asides, what is commonly referred to as riffing. The humour can be juvenile and insult-based. Plenty of punchlines revolve around semen, fat-shaming, or suicide. In part because of the potentially offensive content, relaxed form, and new media delivery, the Little Dum Dum Club is not quite mainstream. Rather, it is mainstream adjacent. While it has high-profile guests like Dave Hughes and Dave O'Neill and strong links to the entertainment industry more generally, for instance, Chandler is a writer for television shows such as The Project and Hard Quiz, like many comedy chatcasts, it has retained its independence without major support from media broadcast companies or management agencies. This mainstream adjacency makes the Little Dum Dum Club a particularly effective case study for showing how the performance of the backstage on comedy chatcasts can reveal industry norms. There are conventions for every aspect of stand-up comedy as a craft and as an industry, but given the time available today, I am going to focus on two: collegiality and success. I'm using an example from the Little Dum Dum Club that will be familiar to any listeners of the show. The Do You Know Hughes story from episode 399, Dave Hughes and Dave O'Neill, and a cluster of running jokes to show the performance of the backstage, revealing the conventions of collegiality and success in the Australian stand-up industry. These examples show the necessity of mateship in cultivating collegiality and engagement in comedy, and the way that the conventional pathway to success has changed over the past decade. When I talk about norms and conventions, I am talking about a general set of expectations about what it is to be a professional stand-up comedian that are socially enforced by comedians, audiences, and participants in the industry. The norms demonstrated and interrogated in the Little Dum Dum Club are not static objects. Rather, they are constantly and recreated things, repeated and altered through that repetition. The Australian comedy industry is small, but it is not a monolith. Deviation from, and even outright refusal of, its norms is possible. Yet generally, even something that seems to radically break with these norms has evolved from and in response to that context. I use the term comedy chatcast to describe the specific kind of podcast I'm investigating. Podcasting scholars Martin Spinelli and Lance Dan define a chatcast as friends gathering around a microphone and simply chatting with little or no planning, editing, or thought to production values, narrative constructions, or podcast direction. This is a format that they consider to be podcast's most abundant form. A comedy chatcast, then, is a chatcast made by comedians. It has the broad aim of being funny, with no high-effort sustained conceit or overarching production value beyond that. Comedy chatcasts are often DIY affairs, produced, hosted, edited, and published by a single creator or small group of creators. Melanie Piper calls this a comedian podcast, a production with a mixture of humour and honesty that is self-reflexive and self-representative for the comedians involved. In short, it is a term to differentiate podcasts like my example of the Little Dum Dum Club, or Piper's example of Walking the Room, from comedy podcasts with more structure, such as Comedy Bang Bang. The formal elements of comedy chatcasts allow comedians to perform in a manner that is different to typical stand-up. Other comedy chatcast scholars, in particular Vince Mazurko, Melanie Piper, and Alex Simmons, have established that comedians' performance of self on comedy chatcasts is perceived to be more honest by comedians and their audiences. Piper uses Irving Goffman's theory of self-presentation to show that comedy chatcasts allow comedians to perform more personal versions of themselves, bringing a backstage self to the front. This honesty is reflected in the way that comedians on Chatcasts interact with one another and discuss their work. In setting up her argument, Piper makes the comment that the flexible, unstructured form of the podcast allows comedians to self-reflexively dissect comedy as both a craft and a business, enabling them to comment on their place in the industry and their experience as comics. I am building on this observation. It is not just the backstage self that comedians are bringing to the front, it is the backstage itself. In an interview with me, Chandler and Daslow commented that while they had no long-term aims for the Little Dum Dum Club when they first created it, they specifically wanted to capture the atmosphere of being backstage at a comedy night. Daslow: "We were just having a lot of fun mucking around and doing all the fun stuff off stage that comedians do before and during the gig, just talking shit with our friends and often finding that more fun than the actual gig." Chandler: "Yeah, all of that stuff about mucking around backstage, I think we were getting more laughs backstage than we were on stage, and so it was like, oh cool, let's do something with this." Backstage is a part of the stand-up workplace, a place where comedians mingle with their colleagues away from the audience before and after going on stage. As Eric Schaus notes, testing out material backstage is considered amateur, but comedians still want to be perceived as funny by their colleagues. Schaus argues that this leads to the swapping of hell gig stories backstage, stories about times when onstage performances didn't go well. It is unsurprising then that in trying to capture the humour of backstage, talk about comedy as work, including hell gig stories, is also performed on comedy chatcasts. The podcast medium lends itself particularly well to this performance of a space that acts as a liminal space between the public stage and the private offstage. Audio scholar Kate Lacey has written in detail on the way in which audio media blurs the delineation between private and public spaces for audiences, with the intrusion of broadcasts into kitchens or the creation of private space through headphone listening on public transport. But chatcasts do this for comedians too. As with the backstage, performances on comedy chatcasts have a professional goal, being funny, that is met through performing interactions and rhetorics usually encountered in private life, conversations, mateship, discussions at the workplace. Of course, unlike the actual backstage, a comedy chatcast is ultimately public, designed to entertain listeners. In line with the backstage sensibility, Chandler and Daslow are of the view that the best episodes are the ones done with their mates. Mateship is a core component of the Little Dum Dum Club. Daslow opens almost every episode with,
"Hey mates, welcome once again into the Little Dum Dum Club for another week. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Tommy Daslow, and sitting next to me, the other half of the program, Carl Chandler."
G'day, dickhead.
This immediately establishes not only the mateship performed on the podcast, but it signals the aggressive way it is performed. Mates is a fluid concept that has been applied to various relationships throughout Australian history over the last 200 years. Historian Nick Dryenfirth has charted the usage of the term through its definition of a working relationship to its near inclusion in the preamble of the Constitution. Mateship describes the bonds of loyalty and equality and feelings of solidarity and fraternity that Australians, usually men, are typically alleged to exhibit. Much of the rest of the world thinks of this practice as friendship pure and simple. Yet in Australia, mateship evokes more than mere friendship. Being mates with someone is a more intimate relationship than simply being colleagues. Important for my use of the term is also the emphasis of mateship as egalitarian, equalising. Yet historically, it can also be exclusionary. Who gets to be mates and who doesn't can have consequences. The performances on the Little Dum Dum Club reveal the overlap of collegiality and mateship in Australian stand-up. This mateship involves an aggressive piss-taking component that seems egalitarian but is in fact not available to non-professionals. This brings me to episode 399, Dave Hughes and Dave O'Neill. This episode features Dave Hughes and Dave O'Neill as guests, two well-known Australian stand-up comedians who have worked together frequently. Like most comedy chatcast episodes, 399 is conversational and the hosts and guests reveal details about one another and themselves, demonstrating familiarity and solidarity. 40 minutes into the podcast, Chandler starts to tell the central story of 399. By way of introduction to the story, Chandler says, "This is something that me and Tommy particularly love, and you, Hughes, have a bit of an involvement in it." Chandler and Daslow repeatedly mention that this story is already familiar to their other comedian mates. They have been talking about it backstage since it happened. It is Hughes and the listener who is hearing it for the first time. As well as hosting the Little Dum Dum Club and performing his own stand-up, Chandler is a successful room runner, managing and booking some of Melbourne's most high-profile comedy nights. Chandler received a Facebook message from a new comic, an open micer, about getting a gig at a comedy night. This is a reasonably frequent occurrence, but the gig in question has not been running for several years. Fed up with these kinds of messages, Chandler ridicules the open micer, responding to him by falsely saying he is Rick Mitchell, another comedian who Chandler finds annoying, and promising a gig so long as he can perform for 45 minutes or get Dave Hughes as a support act. Throughout the exchange, the open micer tries to reassert some conventions of stand-up, suggesting that he opened for another act, reiterating the amount of material he has currently, and informing Chandler that he does not know Hughes. By refusing this and repeatedly insisting the open micer headline with Hughes' support, Chandler is emphasising the conventions that the open micer has ignored. Going to a gig, or even checking to see if it is still running before asking for a spot there, for instance. In the Little Dum Dum Club, however, Chandler is performing his own mateship and collegiality with Hughes. Chandler delivers much of the story as a dramatic reading of sorts, using a sarcastic and flat deliveries for his own messages and added commentary, thereby emphasising that the open micer is foolish for taking him seriously. Hughes, O'Neill and Daslow laugh along throughout the entire read. 5 minutes in, Hughes says, "Is he in on it? I don't think he's in on it." The open micer is not a mate. He's an object of mockery, a fool. And the humour comes from his inability to navigate the norms of the Melbourne stand-up scene and pass the conversation as insulting. Chandler and Daslow draw out the central "I do not know Hughes" quote. Daslow repeats the line, laughing on the word Hughes. Most people do know Dave Hughes professionally, as Hughesy, not Hughes, and there is no reasonable expectation that an open micer would know Hughes personally. Chandler and co find this funny because it reaffirms their collegiality and mateship through the use of a non-professional outsider's gaffe. The sense of mateship is heightened further by their ability to create a performance from it with Hughes in the room. Chandler and Daslow and their fellow comedian friends find the statement funny and use it as an in-joke, and, as evidenced by a quick search of Twitter or the public fan Facebook group, so do the listeners of the podcast. Hughes himself responds positively and says, "I really think you should publish this exchange, at least in the Australian comedy community. This would be a lot of fun." Hughes is not offended by it, something which Chandler and Daslow were concerned about. That concern reveals a slight tension between the performed mateship and the professional nature of the relationship. The comedians do acknowledge that the humour in this story comes from making fun of somebody, but it is ultimately considered to be acceptable by those making the joke.
Look, some people might think that's a bit mean, but I was at my wits' end. You get hit up by so many.
That was just funny.
That was just fun. That was a bit of fun.
No, if he can't handle that, he shouldn't quit comedy anyway.
The sentiment that handling a joke like this is necessary to succeed in comedy again shows the importance of being able to perform as mates. Do You Know Hughes shows the kind of piss-taking mateship and riffing that forms a part of the conventions of collegiality backstage. There is an in-group of professional comedians as mates, reinforcing the norms of engagement for new comedians by demonstrating that approaching it incorrectly will receive derision and mockery. Yet the open micer is not cut off from joining this group. Hughes repeatedly says, "I want to meet this guy," so long as he responds well to the joke and accepts the norms of collegiality. Part of the humour in the Do You Know Hughes story is the position of the three comedians involved within the community, the level of success that they have achieved, and how Chandler inverts those positions and feigns ignorance of them. While the show has always had famous guests, the podcast's longevity allows us to see how the position of the comedians in the industry of stand-up has changed. Conventional milestones of success in stand-up are often discussed on the Little Dum Dum Club, and the podcast's mainstream adjacency influences how comedians reflect on their place in the industry. There has been a rhetorical shift in the way that success is joked about on the Little Dum Dum Club over the last 10 years. This change correlates to the growth of the podcast and podcasting generally, from a medium that is creatively free but financially precarious to a more consistently monetizable platform. This involves conventional milestones of success and how this differs from the successes of Chandler and Daslow. Regular guests who started stand-up at a similar time to Chandler and Daslow, such as Luke McGregor, Ronnie Chang and Nick Cody, began to be signed by management agencies, appeared as guests on television panel shows, had spots on the Melbourne International Comedy Festival opening night gala, and received critical acclaim and large audiences for their solo shows. In some instances, the podcast bolstered the careers of these guests in a way that it did not do for its hosts. These were traditional metrics of success that Chandler and Daslow were not meeting as consistently. In its earlier and middle years, 2010 to 2017, the Little Dum Dum Club had several running gags that revolved around conventional milestones of success in stand-up comedy in Australia. These jokes form a commentary on success similar to the Hell Gig discussions Schaus analyses, the kind of conversation typically had backstage rather than in view of the audience. Chandler, Daslow, and other less mainstream comedians would jokingly ask their more successful colleagues, "How did you get that?" when they were telling stories about their successes. This question, asked from a position of performed naivety, does not seriously involve a request for career advice. Instead, it serves to signal that the comedian being asked the question is progressing. This joke evolved, being incongruously deployed against its established context, so that it is also said in response to more mundane statements. Both the original and its evolution positioned the questioner as lesser than their colleagues, clueless about how to get a gig or a girlfriend or a gym membership. This running joke had two counterparts. "All right, mate, we've all got stuff going on," and clang, where "how did you get that" functions mostly through self-deprecation. "All right, mate, we've all got stuff going on" is an ambivalent attempt at egalitarianism, and clang is outright derisive. "All right, mate, we've all got stuff going on," as a joke, works to dismiss the more successful comedian's position as more successful, attempting to re-establish an egalitarian collegiality while implicitly contrasting whatever the hosts and guests have going on. Clang is a comment made after a comedian name drops, casually mentions an interaction with a more famous person, which calls out the storyteller for bragging about their connections. Like "How did you get that?", "We've all got stuff going on," and clang both became common jokes made in response to non-professional stories and everyday occurrences. This meant that parsing the difference between the original and its subversion requires an understanding of the norms and conventions of success initially expressed on the podcast. In fact, all three jokes became so emblematic of the humour on the podcast that they were printed on its merchandise. In 2016 and 2017, however, these jokes became less frequent. In 2016, Chandler and Daslow established a Patreon, a subscription-based crowdfunding platform, for the podcast. And in 2017, ran the first Koh Samui International Podcast Festival. These events are clear markers of success. The Patreon provided financial stability not reliant on live shows and merchandise, and the Koh Samui International Podcast Festival demonstrated the loyalty and commitment of podcast audiences, willing to travel internationally to see comedy. These running jokes about success first reveal those traditional milestones, the conventions of success as noted and commented on by comedians, before being used as a backstage shorthand, and finally ceasing to be used so frequently once new milestones of success had been created and met. Where the example from episode 399 showed the norms of the Australian stand-up industry performed in the backstage space of the comedy chatcast, the rhetoric of the running jokes about success show how the comedy chatcast has influenced the norms of success in Australian stand-up. That comedy chatcasts have provided new ways to reflect on and build successful comedy careers shows how comedians are adapting and promoting new norms. Comedy often functions by illustratively deviating from social norms in order to reveal them, reinforce them, or alter them. Comedy chatcasts show how this happens within stand-up as an industry too, through the performance of a backstage-like space publicly. Using the Little Dum Dum Club, I've explored the examples of collegiality and success, but there are many other conventions and examples to draw from. My broader project explores some of these topics further, particularly around comedic persona and performances of Australian masculine identity, rhetorics of mental illness and suicidality, and listener engagement. To quote Dustin Goltz in his consideration of comic performativities and potentially offensive material, "By tracing the moment-to-moment reiteration of discursive norms, we can open up a critical space of intervention to do otherwise, not merely to repeat and reflect the pattern, but to challenge the moment-by-moment concretisation of cultural forms. However, it is valuable for us to look at these norms not only when there is a challenge, something which Goltz and collections like Standing Up, Speaking Out do, but also when there is an evolution or even a reinforcement of these norms. Comedy chatcasts provide us with a unique performance space to understand and identify these norms and conventions, helping us as academics to see more of the industry frameworks that contemporary comedy is responding to.